Welcome to the Modern Motherhood Podcast. I'm your host, Lyles Carr, and each week we want to bring you inspiration and empowerment for this journey of parenting that you're on in your relationships with your kids, with your spouse, your work life, and more. And so we are so delighted that you are here with us today. Today our guest is popular podcaster and an author now. You all know her. Her name is Jamie Ivey, and we welcome her to the show to talk about her new book and her path of what it means to really kind of tell it all. Jamie, thanks so much for being part of the podcast today.
Julie, I'm so happy to be with you.
Well, Jamie, you have a brand new book, If You Only Knew, and I am just delighted that I've had a chance to read it. I mean, first of all, congratulations. It's amazing to get to see somebody get to have this experience and have this book come out. And you just have such courage in this book. It's absolutely incredible. So give us a snapshot of the book, the process for writing the book, how it came to be.
I mean, it's so exciting. It's weird to think that I'm going to have a book out there with my name on it, first of all. And then it's weird to think I wrote all this down for everyone to read about my life. But the book is called If You Only Knew. And this book is something I've been wanting to write for a really long time. It's a story of God redeeming my life. And I know for a lot of us, that's a very common theme. God is the Redeemer. That's what he does. And so there are some parts that I think of my story that they're not that crazy. They're not that different. And then there's some things where I walk through some hard times. But the reason I wanted to write the book so badly is because I get to speak with women like you do. And a lot of times I would hear women after they hear parts of my story and they would say to me, that must be really hard for you to say out loud. And I started to realize that we have this whole kind of phenomenon of women, and I'll speak specifically to women because that's who I speak to, women who have things inside of them, maybe past sins, maybe current sin struggles, maybe things that they're embarrassed of, whatever it might be. And they feel as though I can't say these things out loud. Mm-hmm. I can't tell anybody. What would people think? And I get that. I lived for years. If people only knew things that I'd been through, what would they think about me? And so that's why I wanted to write the book. I wanted to share my story. I wanted to share what God's done. And then I wanted to encourage women to do things differently.
I love that you are willing to unpack. You know, you're a pastor's wife. And I think for any of us who are in ministry and have that as part of our family vocation experience, it's really overwhelming to think about, how much what would people do if they might know this, that, or the other of things that I've done and issues we've been through and challenges in a marriage or challenges with a child. And so I think that transparency really speaks to people in a powerful way. I think by example, I think there are going to be women who actually find their voice because of your courage in writing this book. I have a really precious friend who's now in his 80s. He was in ministry for years and years, and he and I recently were at a wedding together. And I thought we might spend some time reflecting on just this incredible career, right, that he's had in ministry, all the people he's helped, all the different things he's done. And instead, he really feels this burden that he didn't, in the course of his ministry, help people discover the art of confession. And I think a lot of ways in your book, it's this confession and it's kind of how to do it. Why do you think that we aren't as much of a confessional faith community as maybe we have been in the past?
I think I think we're embarrassed. I think we feel as though if I were to say this out loud, it would kind of ruin this persona that I've built up, or it would ruin what someone thinks about me. And I think it goes both ways, Julie. I think it lies a lot on the confessor, but I think a lot of this, honestly, is what I'm seeing is it lies on the hearer of the confession. Now, we are, as people who are Christ followers, we are to confess our sins to the Lord, and he is the one who we sin against, and he is the one that can forgive us. But there is something really beautiful about confession within our community. And God's pretty clear, to bring our sin into the light so that he can do things to transform our world. And for me, I think a lot of it is that the people who are hearing our confessions are not handling them well, is what I've seen a lot within, especially women, of feeling like, what would they think about me if they knew this, that kind of thing. The theme of my book, I'm big in like getting things out, because for me, if they stay in, that's when they just fester. That's when they'll start to continue. In my book, I write a lot about past things that happened that I confess and that God's healed me from. But I mean, if I'm honest with you, I had lunch with a girlfriend this week and I sat and cried with her, confessing sin from this weekend, where I was just not the best wife in the world. And I want to be a great wife and I love my husband, and I made some poor choices and I hurt my husband's feelings, and I had already confessed to God and I had already confessed to my husband. But there was something really beautiful about sitting across the table from her And she's such a safe place for me. And I was able to confess that to her. And what she did for me was she didn't just say, oh, you're fine, you're okay. She actually quoted scripture to me. And she actually reminded me that God, although he paid for she said these exact things. He paid for that sin years ago, but he is still persevering me to the end. She was talking about it from Hebrews. And that was just special because I left there. She didn't heal me. She didn't need to forgive me. But the art of that community and confession, it really is something I think that is powerful. And that once you start to get a taste of it, you realize that God can really, really use it to grow you in your faith.
You know, I think you said something really important is that sometimes the person we've confessed to, that we're trying to confess to, is not handling it well. What do you look for in a relationship, in a mentor, in somebody that you can be with to try to mitigate some of that risk? Because it is a risk. I mean, we've all had things that we have entrusted to someone and they have not handled it well. So what do you look for in someone as a friend that you know you have that safe space?
This is the biggest thing that people are wondering is, okay, Jamie, you're asking us to be vulnerable and you're asking us to confess and you're asking us to do all these things, but they're either thinking, I got hurt once before, or they're looking around going, I don't know the first person I would do this with. And for me, when I look at the people that I feel safe with, these people are passionately in love, not only with the Savior, God, Jesus. They love his word. They are invested in his word. And I think the reason that helps them be such listeners and kind of hold those confessions in a safe space is because they understand the depravity of all of our sin. I mean, I know that sounds really churchy, but it is really true. You know, Julie, if people are saying, hey, I get how sinful we are and how we're all in need of a Savior and how Jesus is in the business of forgiving and redeeming us, that when I come to them and confess something, they understand how big God is in the midst of that sin. And so for me, it's a really safe person when I know that they are grounded in the word, that they love God, and that they really do have my best interest at heart. I wouldn't recommend just finding some random person at church and dropping your biggest, darkest secret on them. You know, those taking time and investing, you know, and it's a give and take type of thing. That girlfriend that I sat across the table with, she's said things to me before that I have done the exact same thing for her. And so it is this give and take type of relationship. And I think when we're looking for people who love God, who love his word, I think they're going to be a really safe place for us.
What role do you think confession plays in ultimately God being able to heal us of things that we've been through? Because I think sometimes we think of confession as, well, I'm just going to lay it all out there. But the functionality of confession, do you see that there's a healing component that I'll throw the game, you know, I think we were built for it. I think there's something within us that when we have to own something and process through it, and some of us are more auditory processors than others, but I think there's a healing that comes. What do you think are the benefits of confession when it comes to that long-term healing and growth and maturity?
I think for me, I'll talk about me personally, is that when I get things out in the open, they can't fester in my heart and cause me to either get bitter, to take the sin pretty lightly. You know, with that same example with my girlfriend, I didn't need to share that with her. You know, I had confessed to God. I had asked my husband for forgiveness and he had forgiven me. But for me, the act of saying it to this person that's safe, it was also of me also inviting her in. She has full permission now to be like, hey, how are things now with you and your husband? Or how have you thought any more about the reason maybe that you spoke so unkindly to him? Or she has permission because I've invited her in. And I think that is pretty crucial in our growth, is to bring people in, to allow them to say, hey, you invited me in because you confessed this thing to me, and now I get to walk beside you. And I think if we can find people in our lives that are willing to walk into the trenches, you know, I've invited her into the trenches. Let's go. You are stuck with me and I am stuck with her. And I think it just produces something in me that wouldn't be there if I wouldn't have ever had to say that out loud to someone. You know, and I mean, and here I am, like, I'm not confessing what happened to all of your thousands of listeners because I don't need to do that. But I did do it to my one friend, and that was all I needed to do.
Well, and I think that what you really tap into in your new book, If You Only Knew, that I love is the fact that, yes, we want to have grace with each other. We want to avoid judging one another, but there absolutely is place, and there's a very important place within the Christian walk for us to challenge one another and call each other up to a higher level. And I think sometimes, particularly for those of us who may have had a little bit more legalistic background or whatever, and we discovered grace and ran after it hard, we forget that grace is awesome. And we are supposed to be spurring each other on and encouraging others and with one another to come up higher. I mean, I think that so plays into what you talk about as well, is trying to set a higher standard for ourselves.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, that's hard. It's hard to have a friend look at you and call you out on something.
Ooh, yeah.
Because for me personally, my first instinct is like, mind your own business, first of all. Like, leave me alone. You do you and I'll do me. But it always goes back to the relationships that have been formed. You know, if I had someone that I barely knew come over and call out a sin in my life, I wouldn't be as apt to listen, you know, and it wouldn't be as easy for me to take that from them. But if I have people that I'm walking through life, this is why we value community so much in the Christian faith. It's because when we have people that we are walking with and doing life with, I trust them, you know, and I trust them with it. I mean, another example, this same friend, she's like my confession friend. You know, I called her a couple weeks ago and just confessed, man, I have not been diligent with my time in the Word. And you know what? That's a hard confession to make out loud because you know what? I have a Christian podcast. My husband's a pastor, and I had a season of a couple of weeks where it was just hard for me. And what I did was I said, I want you to ask me about this. Mm-hmm. And so I'm giving her permission to kind of hold me to a higher standard, not from a legalistic point, but from a point of like, she loves me and she wants me to love Jesus with all I have. And so I'm saying, hey, I need you to help me. I need you to help me with this. And I think that it takes a lot to ask. Mm-hmm. That's like laying down our pride, you know, but it takes a lot also to be the person that says, hey, I love you. And if you tell me that I'm holding you accountable and you tell me you failed again, I'm not going to think less of you. I'm going to keep loving you and I'm going to keep pointing you to Jesus. And so it's like, it's both ways.
Right. Well, and I think too, you know, sometimes we, for some reason, think that, you know, blasting people for a particular sin on our social media channels or, you know, having a really hardline opinion on something, wow, that's really going to change people. But at least I know in my own life, if I'm really wanting to affect change, it really does come down to that relational component, that trust, that being able to see how someone else is walking. I don't get real convicted from somebody's angry social media post about certain things.
Me either. I'm done with that.
Yeah. I'm
no
thanks. But, you know, part of what I think is also fascinating in this book is you're super bold. I mean, you really lay it out there and you're very honest about things in your past. Now, in being so honest and direct, how did you navigate knowing that your kids, you know, could eventually read this book? I mean, I sometime in my prayer journals or in my journaling time, I'll kind of hedge the bet. I might not say exactly what I'm thinking in case my kids find one of these years later down the line. So how did you navigate those waters?
Yeah, it was a hard thing for me. And I had to really kind of think, if I feel that God is going to use my story, to encourage women, to help women to maybe overcome some of these same things that I've walked through, and to point women to Jesus, it came down to, am I more concerned about what my 4 children might think versus what the kind of impact that we could have, we as in like me and this book and my life, for the gospel and for Jesus. And so it's not that I'm disregarding my kids at all, but I also had to really come to terms with, I really believe that, you know, as God was moving me forward in writing this book, that at no time was he ever caught off guard by the fact that I have 4 children that might read this book someday. And I felt very confident in what I was saying. And also, man, I want to not only be an open book with just random strangers that are going to pick up this book. I mean, my desire is to be an open book with my kids.
Right.
And so anything that I wrote in there is nothing that I would never tell them. Now, my 10-year-old daughter, does she need to know these things in the book? No, not at all. One day when we have the conversations about this, will she know these things? Of course. Mm-hmm. Obviously, these are things that I would share with my kids anyway, not as a, oh my gosh, look like at the bad choices your mom made. But for me, I hope it's the same reason I share the book with everyone else, not so you can say like, oh my gosh, I can't believe Jamie Ivey did that. But I would hope and I pray that the message comes across as, look how amazing God is. Look at how God redeems her life and still uses her. And that's what I want my kids to see as well. It's no different, actually.
Yeah, I think sometimes we try to approach gospel living from a perspective of, you know, I just want to have this perfection, right? I want to make sure that my kids think that I've had this perfect Christian life. And, you know, if we could live perfect lives, then his sacrifice wouldn't have been necessary for us. So in that interesting way to take a pride, if you will, in where we've come from and where we've gotten to is really a pride in the gospel, what the gospel can do. And yet I know so many mamas who are so afraid of their kids knowing some of the things from their pasts because they think in a weird way, right? That, well, what if that means that then my kids will replicate what happened? And so sometimes I'll see the response being that mama will be even more strict with her kids, or there will be more household rules as she tries to mitigate any kind of risk that her kids might fall into some of the same patterns that maybe she fell into in her teens and her 20s, that kind of thing. How can moms find courage to appropriately and in a healthy way? Now, I think that's a really important distinction. I think you do it so beautifully in this book. But to make sure that mamas are doing it in a way that is healthy, but is also trying to get over some of that fear about really sharing where she's walked.
Yeah, I think it's something that you have to wrestle with the Lord is, that's like the big answer. And although that sounds really churchy, it is really true because I know that I understand that fear. Oh my gosh, I dread the day, Julie. I dread the day that I have to tell my kids that I did not save myself for marriage. Now, we've talked with sex about our kids. They've all had the talk many, many times. We are a very open, conversating family about that subject. But that day's going to be hard, It's going to be sad for me. But I pray to God, and I really think that my kids are going to see the gospel represented in my life, and they're going to see that although I made some poor choices, that God never left me, that God still had a plan for me, and he still was in the business of working in my life. I don't think that me sharing with my kids that I was sexually active before I met their daddy is going to cause them to be like, oh, well, then I guess I can be as well. And I think that's our fear. Our fears are going to be like, oh, well, then they're just going to do what I do. Well, actually, no, because we're teaching them the gospel. I mean, if you're not, and I was about to say, if you're not teaching them the gospel, they might do anything, but I just want to not say that because, we don't know what our kids are going to do. And just to take some of the this kind of big burden off of our mama hearts is that we can't keep our kids from doing things and we cannot make them do things. God is in the one that's in control of their hearts. And so our responsibility is to give them the gospel, point them to Jesus, bring that into our household, talk about it night and day, put it in our house, all of those things. And then our kids make their own choices, and golly, is that hard to grasp? I want to make my kids make all good choices, right? Don't we?
Right.
If we could, we would. But I think it's an opportunity for us to show them the gospel. It's one more chance for them to show them the way that Jesus works. And I think if we're presenting our kids with what we think are perfect put together parents, I think they're going to be slightly misdirected when they get out into the real world. And they thought, oh, I thought my parents never did anything wrong. Right. Wow, I'm doing something wrong. What's wrong with me? And so I think that we get a unique opportunity to point them to Jesus in that way within our own home.
We'll be right back with our amazing interview with Jamie Ivey, author of If You Only Knew and popular podcaster of The Happy Hour with Jamie Ivey, here in just a little bit. But first, I wanted to make sure that you are developing a community of moms that you can share ideas with, you can be encouraged by. That's why I want to make sure that you know about MOPS. MOPS, it stands for Mothers of Preschoolers, and MOPS' purpose is to gather moms. MOPS believes in a simple but a revolutionary idea that remarkable things happen when women who are in those parenting seasons can come together and share their hearts. And that's why MOPS rallies women in their own neighborhoods to help them be more brave, more kind, more honest, one gathering at a time. And so if you are looking for a community of moms that you can share your heart with, your experiences with, that you can develop tools and be empowered for your parenting journey, be sure and check out mops.org. That's MOPS.org. And you there can find a community and find a local gathering that you can get plugged into and find those friendships and encouragement that you need. That's mops.org. And now let's get back to this interview with Jamie Ivey. I think part of what I love in this message of your book, and knowing that eventually your kids, will have access to it and will know more of your story, I think sometimes as moms, we can be really guilty of confusing naivete with purity. Meaning we think if we can block our kids from all kinds of different knowledge, from knowing, anything about poor decisions we made or different things that were in our past, that somehow it's going to ensure a purity. But that's just naivete. That's not really a choice for, I'm going to live a certain way, I'm going to make decisions a certain way. I mean, where do you see sometimes that we get a bit confused between, this concept of naivete versus purity?
Oh, I mean, because we want the best for our kids. And so we think in our head, if they don't know these things, then there's no way they can either choose them or participate in them or be a part of them. When the reality is, I mean, our kids are learning these things. It's 2018,
Yeah.
Our kids are inundated with images and ideas and thoughts from their peers around them, from media, sometimes from teachers at school. And so our approach here at the Ivey household is we want you to hear about it from us first.
Right.
So all of our kids know about pornography. You know why? Because I don't want them to hear the word porn or whatever else kind of word that we can't say on this podcast and feel as though, oh, I've never heard that before. Because what's going to happen, Julie, is they're going to think my parents are dumb. They don't know this.
Right.
And I want my kids to know I'm not stupid. I know all these things. Like I know everything. I remember just a couple weeks ago, I asked my sons if they knew what a word meant, and I won't say it on here. It's not like really, really bad, but just, whatever. And two of them said yes, and one of them said no. And the thing is, I want them to know I know these things already. You don't have to, when you hear these things, it's not a secret because we know what secrets breed. They breed fear and they breed shame and they breed where they think, oh, my parents don't know about this. And so for us, we don't want them to be naive on things. Now, am I having the same conversation with my 10-year-old daughter? Not yet, but I will, age appropriate. And so we really believe let's be the ones that introduce our kids to these things, not in like a bad way, but introduce them to the word, to what it is, so that they know the truth about it. So that when someone presents pornography to them, they actually have heard us say that this is something that will separate them from God, that this is a sin, that this is degrading towards women and men and children. And so that's how we want to do is we want them to know the truth about things before they hear it from, their really stupid, silly friends.
Well, and I think too, the person that you hear something from for the first time that maybe you haven't known about, that person becomes the expert for you.
Yes.
And I want my kids to, have the sense, like you said, that, I've got a window on this. I can help inform you on this, because my mom and I laugh about it now, but she was so hesitant to discuss some of the difficult things with me along these kind of lines. And we laugh about the morning after Mike and I got married. She said, "Oh, honey, there were some things I meant to tell you." And I was like, well, Mom, I think we're good. I think we'll move on. But,
that's hilarious.
But I can remember, in my world when certain words started coming up and certain topics started coming up and it was like, well, the sixth graders were the experts, right? Because these were things I hadn't heard. And so, whoever I was hearing it from for the first time was the one who, they're a genius on all of these topics.
Yeah.
So
yeah. That's so true.
I loved too. I recently read a book by a guy who's one of the major trainers for people who compete in CrossFit. So, I'm not a CrossFit athlete whatsoever. But I appreciate what they put themselves through. But I loved that he said, I do have my athletes walk through visualization of what it would feel like to do well in whatever they're competing in. He said, but the other thing that we go and do is we also visualize, okay, if things don't go exactly the way we're anticipating, then how are we going to respond? And part of what I loved about that is I think sometimes as moms, we try to create a construct if we can just get the right filters on our internet and if we can just keep the bad channels away from our television, and if we can just make sure that their friend group are all sweet, precious little darlings who never say anything, then that's our strategy for equipping our kids. And yet we have to go into it knowing that the world's going to be pretty insistent on getting some messages and some images in front of them. So what are the strategies, when you're tempted? It's not about try to avoid all temptation. It's when you're tempted, you can stand. And I think those are the kinds of things as moms we can be really intentional about. What are some things you want to try to inculcate in your kids, temptations that you came up against that you found difficult to resist? What are some lessons learned that you want to share with your kids about how to stand? And again, it will be their choices. You're absolutely right. But how do you think it would help to equip them to perhaps make choices that you might have chosen something different?
Yeah, one of these things, our three oldest are boys. And so something that's heavy on Aaron and I's heart is the issue of pornography. And, the thing that I think I even talk about pornography a little bit in the book. And, when we were younger, it's like you had to go find pornography. And it feels like now it's just kind of trying to devour people. Yeah. And our young kids are at such a high risk. And so although we have every safeguard in our house that you could possibly imagine, my kids were exposed to pornography one time at a beauty salon.
Yeah.
And so there they were in another room. I was right there at the place, and a little boy showed them a video on his mom's phone. And I didn't hear about it that day. They were super young. And honestly, I really think, Julie, they don't have a memory of it, which that's just like, I could cry at just begging God for that, because they were so young, and I'm so thankful for that. But I overheard them talking about it later, and so I was able to have a conversation with it. And I remember when that happened, sobbing in my room, because I just felt like, my babies, what do I do now? Like, where do we go from here? And it was in that moment that kind of Aaron and I realized, like, we can do everything possible. We can do everything possible to protect our kids. And sometimes things like this are going to happen. For us, we do a lot of kind of role play per se. Like, I've had conversations with my kids about, and since we're talking about pornography, about this, like, hey man, has anyone ever shown you anything on their phone? Or what if somebody does? What do you think you should say? How would you tell them you don't want to look at that? Trying to give them language, because there's one thing that happens that we all remember when we were teenagers, or, older teenagers, younger teenagers, is you don't want to be the odd man out, right?
Right.
You don't want to be the one person that says, dude, I don't want to look at that. And so we want to try to help them. What are some language? What's some words that you can use that you can be like, still cool? You don't have to like be the weird person, but just to be like, I don't want to be a part of that. And so we try to give them language. We've talked to our oldest son already. He's not like going to parties or people's houses, but we know that's on the horizon. He's 14. And so we've given him language about what would be okay if it was there, what would be not okay if it was there. How can you get a hold of us if you need something? And then the major thing that I think is really important for parents, that I will admit is harder for me and easier for my husband, is to not freak out when things don't go the way you think you should. Aaron is like calm. He can handle it. I go into what were you thinking type of mode. And what that does to our kids is it just shames them and makes them not willing to come to us the next time. And so I'm personally, that's a goal of mine, to get through the next couple of years with these teenagers and react appropriately. But I think that's something we can really learn as parents, is that we want our kids to know right and wrong and truth and lies and what is okay and what is not okay for your family. But we also really want to be a safe place so that when they make a bad decision, and let me tell you, they will, that they're able to come to us and we're able to kind of guide them and lead them. If there's punishment, there is. If there's consequences, so be it. But they still feel safe and they still feel loved. And so I think that's really, really important for parents.
I absolutely love that tip, to really help your kid role play, talk through it, equip them with language. I think it's critical, and I think it's awesome that you guys are so strategically doing that. I was a guest on a podcast last week, and we talked a little bit on this topic, and we were talking about that place of wanting it to be safe for our kids to be able to tell us whatever, to be able to confess, right? Like, we want to be, while we also want to make sure we're about the discipline of confessing our sins, we also want to be that place that kids feel like they can confess. And I was talking about that need to channel your inner Meryl Streep sometimes when your kids tell you something that you're just floored, but you're going to keep this exterior on the outside that's like, tell me more about that.
Yes.
Really?
Yes.
Even if internally.
And on the inside, I'm freaking out. Like, when is your dad going to come? I could not do this alone.
I know. Why are you telling me? Why isn't your dad here?
Yes.
Yeah. To try to channel that. Well, I love in the book that you discuss something that I think I've seen so often, particularly in ministry to women, which is we can sort of get those reputations that maybe we didn't want and certainly wasn't our goal, but after a while we begin to think of ourselves with that label. And you walk through several labels that you feel like you wore through the years based on the challenges that you were having, the sin you were wrestling. And yet, even though we can come to that place that we didn't want to be that person or didn't want to be seen as that, or on and on and on, it can become this kind of odd, warm, safe blanket for us rather than actually going through change. How did you finally learn to let go of some of the labels that you had acquired over time that in a sense may have been strangely more familiar than launching out into this, new world of living a more redeemed life and falling in love with a man who was a pastor and, all these different things that didn't seem to line up with the labels that you felt like you had acquired over time?
Yeah, for me personally, one of the things I started to realize is that I was actually the only one labeling myself. For years, I felt like everyone saw the labels I was giving myself. I felt like everyone was placing them on me. I felt like I would walk into a room and everyone would say, "Oh, she's that girl," you know? And I think, although maybe there would have been some truth in that, and sometimes what I started to realize is that I was the only one who was thinking these things. And that really became true to me when I moved away and had to make all new friends, and they don't even know my story. And I still am carrying these labels. And I think finally one day I was like, they don't even know. So how could they label me? They're not. Jamie, you're labeling yourself. And so I started to realize it was just me that was carrying around these labels. And it did seem more comfortable because it made me feel like I know how to be this person. I know how to be the person that carries shame, you know, or even before I started following Jesus, even feeling like I know how to date this way. I don't know how to date as a Christian. And so for me, it was like realizing, no one's told me these things. No one's putting these labels on me. I'm the only one that knows about them. And then B, it really goes back a lot to that community that we talked about earlier. When I started to feel as though I could say things out loud and nobody looked at me side eye and no one thought to myself, wow, that really surprised me about you, you know, or never would have seen that coming, Jamie. When I started to be able to say those things out and people weren't just necessarily shocked, or they were like, okay, this is fine. It's when I started to be able to let some of those things go. Now, I mean, I shared with you at the beginning 2 confessions I've made in the past 2 weeks to friends. And so it's like, not that this goes away. It's just that you learn how to fight it. Right. You know, as I was sitting there across from my girlfriend, even confessing this week about, you know, being mean to my husband over the weekend, you know, I was labeling myself, you know, like I was not worthy to be a follower of Jesus. I was a terrible wife, you know, all of these things. And she was able to speak into that with like her love and reminded me of God's love. And so it was me to make a choice of, I'm not going to carry these labels this week because they're not really who I am. I may have felt like that over the weekend, but I've moved past it. I've been forgiven. I'm going to put back on the identity that I know I have, which is, you know, child of God, redeemed, love, all those things. And so I think, you know, the community helped me, and then realizing I was the only one labeling myself, and then really making a choice that I'm going to choose actually to walk in what God says about me to be true.
I love that perspective that really confession can be a weapon to help really reinstill your true identity, because I do think there's a lot that we wear secretly that we just, you know, as you say, and no one knows. You said that in so many environments.
No one knows.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, what a statement, and how it can keep those labels. You know, when you forget you have a sticky label that you put on a piece of clothing and then it runs through the dryer, right? And it feels like that label's never, ever going to come off again. And yet I think what you're saying metaphorically within this incredible tool of confession is, it can come off. Even the residue that you think is there, it can be peeled away when we begin to steal back some of its power from it, because secrets do have a power, right? I mean, secrets do keep us so bound. And, you know, the Word of God talks about bringing things into the light, and then all of a sudden they do begin to lose some of their power over us. Yeah. Yeah. For those mamas out there who feel like, oh, but Jamie, if you only knew, you know, the things that I'm carrying, the things that maybe I've never even said to my spouse that I sure as heck don't want my kids to know, what would be something you would want to leave her with today, particularly as we get ready to celebrate this book launch and its birth and how exciting that is? What do you really want these mamas to take away?
You know what? I think the best thing for that is I want women, I want moms to really believe what God says about them. And, you know, I was telling a group of women the other day, and I was like, man, the thing is about our Christian faith is that we believe something that if you really think about it, it sounds crazy, that God created the world, and then there was sin, and then he sent his son Jesus, and his son Jesus never sinned, and then he died on a cross, and then he was buried, and then he rose again, and he's going to heaven to wait for us. Outside of the fact that the Bible is true and that our lives have been changed, you know, that sounds kind of crazy, right? And we believe that because it's changed our lives. We believe it because we read about it. But yet we're so easy to be like, yes, 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 I believe this. But I'm having a hard time believing that God can still love me. Or I'm having a hard time believing that he actually can forgive this sin. I'm having a hard time to believe that what he says, that, you know, our sin is as far from the east as to the west. We don't believe those things about what he says about us. And I think that when we start to believe that what he says about us matters more than what anybody else thinks, more than what your husband thinks, more than what your kids think, more than what the pastor's wife at church thinks about you, more than what your coworker thinks, more than anyone thinks about you, it matters what he thinks about you. And so my desire is just for women to believe what he says about them to be true. And I think when we do that, our lives begin to change because that he says that will happen. And so let's hold him to his word that he will change our lives and that we will look more like him and that we will be the light in the world as well. And so that's what I want for women.
Well, what an incredible conversation with Jamie Ivey. Be sure and check out her brand new book coming out, If You Only Knew, comes out January 30th. All kinds of gorgeous, gorgeous dialogue in that book, just talking about her experience and how she wants to use that moving forward. So be sure and check it out. And you can also find out more about Jamie at jamieivey.com and on Facebook, Instagram, all those great places. And she is the host of the Happy Hour with Jamie Ivey. Great podcast. Be sure and give that a listen. I'd love to connect with you more too. Be sure and find me at julielylescarr.com. And I'm also on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and all the places. So be sure and check that out. And also AllMomDoes.com. We have fantastic posts that are written there, all kinds of great information by a team of women who are just wanting to empower and inspire. Be sure and check that out at allmomdoes.com. Want to give a big thank you to Rebecca Beckett, who is our content coordinator, and Donna Toti, who's our producer. Hey, next week, can't wait for this guest. Jenny Allen is going to be with us. She is the founder of the If Gathering. So be sure and tune in next week. Make sure you subscribe so you get it right to your podcast inbox. That's the best way to go. And hey, if you could review the Modern Motherhood Podcast for us, that is so helpful. Really helps people be able to find us on iTunes and all those places. So we sure appreciate you reviewing us, subscribing, all those good things. Can't wait to see you next week for a fantastic interview with Jenny Allen.